evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Bone Club. It's me, Ashley, here with you, with Stephanie, and our really good friend of ours, Dr. Sam Blatt. And unfortunately, Jenna is away from us. She is celebrating Canadian Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving to all of you Canucks out there. I wish I was able to celebrate it with you this year. It's my second one I'm missing. It's always a fantastic time. So, we have a very interesting topic for you, I think, this month. It's on really the relationship of trans and gender diverse individuals with forensic anthropology. And it's one of those topics that got me as an individual interested in the field, got me sort of just saying, I want to be a forensic anthropologist because I always wondered, how would I be identified if I was dead? How would I be identified through my skeleton? And luckily for us today, we have Dr. Blatt with us, who has published numerous times and presented numerous times on this topic, and has been one of those authors that has been really pushing for change in the field in how forensic anthropology addresses transgendered individuals and gender diverse individuals. So, Dr. Blatt, welcome. Welcome, Sam. How are you doing this evening?
Thank you. I'm doing well today. I also wish I was celebrating Canadian Thanksgiving. I forgot about
Now, real question, does Canadian Thanksgiving also include turkey, ham, stuffing, all the things that I like about actual Thanksgiving, not actual Thanksgiving, that's not the right
it.
word for that, but the Thanksgiving that I know.
Oh, yes. Canadian Thanksgiving has all the Thanksgiving trimmings that American Thanksgiving has, with the exception of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
I mean, that's valid. That's a lot of plastic in the air, so it's okay.
I can live without that. Yeah, that's fine.
So,
I,
well,
I guess to start off with, I know the first thing that we usually do for, every episode, and so some of our listeners who have been with us throughout our little I want to say tenure, but it's not. Um, know that try to start out with asking what brought you into the field of forensic anthropology. Was it you watched Bones as a child and things like that, or like what really brought you to love the field, and then what brought you into liking the topic that we're talking about today?
So I actually have seen like maybe one Bones episode, so I'm like one of those weird ones that but I would say initially bioarchaeology. So I see myself as doing both bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology, uh and so classes in bioarchaeology, and then being in weird states like Idaho, that initially when I came to Idaho, there wasn't really anybody here doing forensics, and so it was a need. And I've always I think my interest in this topic stems from bioarchaeology, where we look at gender. Gender is a written about a lot in bioarchaeology, and there's a lot of theories behind it, and it has some history to it. But to be quite honest about it, for forensic anthropology, it wasn't until maybe like 2018 or 2019 where I had a student that asked me, that had the same question that you just brought up, Ashley, like how would I be identified? And and they wanted to know this in forensic sense. And of course I could say, oh, in bioarchaeology, we would do this and design a project like this. And you would have all this, this archaeological information that we would be integrating. And in forensics, I was like, I don't know. And so it was really like one of the first times I thought about it. And then I'm friends with founders of the Transdo Task Force and who are transgender, and that was their main question as well. And there was not an answer or an infrastructure. And so it became personally interesting, and also just like, why is nobody looking at this? This is a big hole. And because of my background in bioarchaeology, um, I feel like I was uh, more easily able to think about gender in ways that maybe some forensic anthropologists don't, because if you're strictly trained as a forensic anthropologist, like gender and other biocultural aspects of anthropology don't come into play as often as they do in bioarchaeology. And so I think that that's helped me a lot in forensics, um, maybe to a detriment, some might say, but the biocultural interest that I have, that extends beyond just the skeleton and stats, has really, I think, made it easier for me to be open and try to and be a listener and open to having other people try to understand why gender is important just in anthropology, and absolutely is in forensics. But it's a different world to me. Seeing this in forensic world is a very different world. But yeah, it
Yeah.
started honestly not too long ago, and then we kind of, a group of people I regularly write with, kind of we ran with this, and there was other folks doing it, looking at this at the same time, and so it was really exciting to see where this could go. And we held like a workshop. We had like 400 people. This was a webinar in, what was it, like 2021? It seems so long ago now. um, and that kicked it off. Um, so yeah, that it's a long story. I've been around for a while, but like the bioarch and forensics hasn't like integrated itself so well until the last few years for me with gender.
No,
And I think
I
that's the
mean,
thing that I love most about forensics to me now, is that I feel more comfortable bringing in this bioarch anthropology side, and that it is important to all the students out there. Like your classes in cultural anthropology are important to being a biological anthropologist.
no,
Um,
totally agree. I mean, that's definitely one thing at work we say a lot, and it probably not enough if we're honest, is you're anthropologist first.
yeah.
Like, yes, you're doing
Yes.
forensics, yes, you're doing forensic techniques, yes, you're trying to answer a legal question, but you're an anthropologist first, and don't forget that, because then you're going to skew to a point where you're not actually doing anthropology anymore and you're just doing bad science.
Yeah.
There was a line that we put into a paper uh, in 2024. We need to bring anthropology back into forensic anthropology, and that's part of the reason for it. But I'm interested because I think there's a lot of different ways to define these, and I know it's the political gotcha question that's out there every time you see anything on social media, anything you see on video or TV, but how would you define sex and gender?
Mhm. And I definitely never considered myself like an expert in gender. I've learned a lot from a lot of people in the last few years. And the biggest thing I've learned is that um, people still conflate these two terms. And
Mm-hmm.
I never thought about how badly they do that. Um, Sex, not an easy thing to define. Um, it's to me not a binary where we have two choices, and for a lot of reasons biologically there are a lot of reasons why. You can go chromosomally, you can go phenotype, and like, secondary sexual characteristics, but there's not one way of defining it, and I think that's been some of the problem, and debate has been caused by that. There really is not one definition. um, and even I mean, even amongst the papers that I've written, and people that I write with, we don't all agree, and we don't all, we our ideas change about which terms we should use.
Yeah.
depending on, we talk about a lot, like, and they change. And they have in our field too. And so it's important to realize that that's normal, by the way, like that's normal in every field, that every field changes their terms. It is, there's usually some politics behind it and things like that. And so it's really good to know like the history of that. But um the easiest difference that people seem to, you know, um adjust best to is that there's the biological differences, which number, like I said, this can be chromosomal, this can be the phenotypic traits that you see, like it can be the skeletal traits that you use in skeletal sex estimation, versus gender, which is, you know, identity and fluid and changing. It's your own identity. It's an identity that others perceive upon you about what your roles are, depending on masculinity and femininity and what you should be doing and your behavior, what you should be wearing. And that's cultural. And that is, and again, go back to what you are as a base anthropologist, taking cultural anthropology. Like we learn that, you know, there are cultures that have like their standard of 5 genders and that they change through an individual's life even. And this is what we learn as an anthropologist. And so you can't just, we shouldn't just forget these things. But that is true of all culture. We don't think about our own culture very often. We outside of male and female binaries for sex or gender, but they're defined also by our culture, which has also changed through time. And so even when we're looking at like individuals in Western culture and trying to not ascribe gender, but understand somebody's identity, gender identity, you have to understand the time period which we're talking about as well. And so it's not as easy as stats, which we all think are very hard. By the way, I think are very hard, but this is harder. Understanding sex and gender is harder than, you know, statistics, much harder. And that's probably why there's such a big argument about it.
No,
And
for
it's not something that can be settled by a single tweet.
No,
no.
no, or
Well, it's
cell
also
size or anything like that. No.
it's also kind of going back to how you're saying, like, yes, stats are hard, and I chose a degree that didn't have to do math for a reason, and you know, whatever. But the numbers tend to be binary and simple, but then they also, when used to explain culture, miss so much. And so I think that's like one thing that I always, a lot of times when I read reports or like see papers that like are really really stats heavy, which is nice because like it's like, okay, you grounded in some numbers and whatever, but what you're trying, the answer, like the question you're trying to answer isn't static like that. So the numbers, while helpful, aren't the whole picture, and I think that gets lost a lot in forensic anthropology for sure.
And people also have the it's easier to say, oh, biology is this objective thing, and so we should apply stats to it. And then in that culture, this is why we have what we say hard science and softer science. Like those terms are just bad terms, they're erroneous
Squishy
terms.
science.
But like how you say culture, you know, if somebody says studying the humanities and cultures, it's considered a different type of study than biology. And that's incorrect also. And there's not just a yes and a no answer to anything in the biological natural world. That's just not, that's there's lots of evidence against that. There's a great book that just came out this year, Augustine Fuentes' book, the Sex is a Spectrum, where he even talks about the ideology basis of the binary idea of male female versus a spectrum of sex, and it you know it there is an ideology behind it, which means that it's not as simple as numbers. And that if you're going to define even biologically, like this is what sex is, like maybe you should be more specific and say, well, I'm talking about chromosomes right now, which is not remotely binary for sex. Not like, and we teach this in our introduction to biological anthropology class, like I do, because it's fascinating, and and we're talking, as anthropologists, again, we're talking about diversity of humans and evolution biologically and culturally, and just looking at the diversity of chromosomes, like everybody should be like fascinated. I would think you'd be fascinated by that, not just wanting something to be more simplistic. And that's just not how the natural world works. And so, unfortunately, that the answer for defining biological sex, or um, we keep going back to maybe calling it for forensic osteological sex or skeletal sex. We haven't really decided. There's still that debate. It's just changing. There isn't one definition, and there hasn't been in forensics, and that's one of the biggest problems, is there's not been a standard of terms with definitions.
No,
So
for
that
Well,
sure.
we hope there's one coming soon.
yes, we hope there's one coming soon. We spent a lot of time trying to write definitions with a lot of help. Um, but there hasn't been. And I mean, I had a student, two students that last year at AFS looked at the language of sex and gender in the abstracts of AFS for the last 20 years, and in all of the sections, not anthropology, but all of the sections. And there's been a lot of conflation where sex and gender are assumed to be the same thing, and are used that way. And then there's just been, in anthropology, interestingly, you see the change of terminology, where it's more common to say biological sex nowadays, um, when, you know, before, I mean, there was talking more about sexual determinism and things like that. Those are more common terms. And so, sometimes we need to take a step back and we need to look at what is going on in our field so that we can understand where we came from, and maybe why. There are probably historical reasons for why some of these terms were changing out, but anthropology is the one that's changing them. Everybody else, all of these other sections are really staying the same. They're not investing in definitions. And so, anthropologists, then, why aren't we can do that then. I'm not I'm not an English professor, but like I can look up things and I can tell you what I think about them. And if we need to help, other sections in forensic sciences have more of a standard by which we can have a shared understanding of a word, then we should be doing that, because anthropologists seem to be the ones most motivated to do that. And so, some of what we're doing yet now, hopefully in this one paper, is trying to do that. Um, Again, but these are living terms. They're going to change
Yeah,
as needed, but hopefully, if people will stop using some terms and use other ones, and at least have a definition for them. So if
right.
you're using a term, I can at least know what you mean.
Well, I
Yeah, I
wonder if
mean,
that's because, like I had said, we're trying to bring anthropology back into forensic anthropology, and I wonder if that's because that is happening with, I don't want to say younger, but this more sort of younger set, the us's, the collective us's right now, in the field, that have that mindset of trying to say, the sociocultural anthropology is not that bad, and we need to incorporate it. Because I remember when I first started coming to AFS, the very first meeting was when they dropped the term physical
Mm.
from the anthropology section. And that was a big deal because, well, that means that the cultural anthropologist could come in. And there were a lot of older people that did not want that to happen. But now you have younger individuals who are more willing to embrace our cultural cousins, academic cousins. and bring in those theories, bring in those ideas. But when you look at the other sections, the other areas of forensic science, they don't have that humanities sort of subfield that's related to them. There's no humanities side of pathology. Pathology is pathology. You have clinical and you have forensics and anatomical, but you don't have a humanities side. There's no humanities toxicology. There's no humanities biology. So we have that sort of side piece that we're able to build on, that we're able to churn on, and we're able to relate to because they're in our departments. And we're able to talk to them, and we can sort of churn up these definitions and churn up new ideas that the other uh, sort of areas of forensic science just don't have access to.
Well, and I
Yeah,
think
great
a lot
point.
of it goes back to, I mean, I feel like I probably bring up my thesis every episode, but it all goes back to people thinking that they can be objective when you can't
Yeah.
because you're people. And so, like, I mean, my thesis itself was seeing if, like, gendered clothing affected sex assessment. And that is getting at that exact, like,
Yeah,
is what you're seeing contextually affecting how you pretend to be objective for this skeletal sex assessment?
yeah,
And the answer is yes. And so it's like, let's not, I think it's so much of science, and especially for like forensic science, like for anthropology specifically, there's been such a push for so long to say we're separate from that. We aren't we aren't bioarchaeologists, we're not cultural anthropologists, we're forensics. We're hard science. We're objective. We can be the ground truth of what biology is. And there just isn't that because people are doing the science. And so it's like trying to pretend to be something that we're not and that we can be in ourselves binary in our decisions doesn't help.
I think we have in as forensic anthropologists, like you have another level of responsibility to use your knowledge, like all of it, and direct it in a way, and that can be difficult because we're in an interesting position of like more of an academic kind of background than a lot of forensic scientists are. And but that does and so you have to communicate in a new way. But I think that that shouldn't mean that you drop certain things. Like, I mean, there just the last couple of years, there's a couple of articles, trying to reintroduce, evolutionary theory in forensic anthropology too. And it's like, well, how is that ever lost? Like, we're literally looking at variation, but yet it's sort of lost because you have to talk to different types of people in a way that they can understand, but that doesn't mean that you avoid um, the truth of the matter, even like the truth of our statistics. Don't simplify it to the point that it's wrong. Um, and and I think that that has got away from some people, and that it needs to just be reiterated to, especially to students when, if you're a lover of bones and taking biological anthropology and want to do forensic anthropology, and because I've met some students like this that don't want to take that cultural class or even like an archaeology class, um, that we reiterate to them in biological anthropology why you need that class. That it is going to be a daily part of your operations as an anthropologist. You're there as an anthropologist. You're not just there as somebody who looks at bones and numbers, because that's your results, and then you need to interpret them, and that's a broader ability, and that's broader information, that's contextual information, and don't forget that you need that, and don't forget who you are as an anthropologist, because I think you can forget that when you're working in the government or with law enforcement all the time, because it's a different type of environment from where you came from.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I have one question for both of y'all, having done this type of research and lived experience and things like that. But like, so kind of at the end of my thesis, kind of our decision was like, well, one, we need more anthropologists because obviously context is affecting our sex assessments and they're affecting, how we're making these overall interpretations. But in trying to, like, for application purposes, for going to law enforcement, of giving, a biological profile or giving some type of context into who the person likely was, because what they're trying to figure out is who is it. And
Mhm.
so if I use the context too much and sway it too far into, well, now I'm saying female sex and I'm not, like, because, I saw a dress or heels or whatever, and I'm ignoring some of the skeletal traits that are conflicting that, well,
Mhm.
that actually gives me a bigger picture of, okay, someone has skeletal traits that might be considered more masculine or might be considered more male biologically, but they're wearing feminine clothing, and that gives you a bigger picture of who the person is. I guess, what would y'all's guidance be? Maybe, and obviously, like, I'm not saying like you have to have a full answer of this is what we should all do now, but like, the how do we go about understanding context and having that context, because it is important for the overall picture, but for that context to not bias our first assessment, if that makes sense. Because it's like, if the contextual information is biasing that first context to a different answer, then we're not getting the bigger picture. And so, like, I know for like my advisor and I, we were like, well, maybe we have more than one anthropologist, one person that knows none of the context and one person that knows all the context. And then you mash all of the information together to give that assessment to law enforcement or whatever. Um, but there's not very many of us. We don't get paid very well enough. So then, like, is that practical? How do we go about doing that? I didn't know if y'all had any ideas, I guess.
So,
We do.
and you're not far off. So if I want to introduce like this idea because I haven't said it yet, but so abbreviated as COSAGE, COSAGE, which is contextual observations in support of all gender expressions, is this idea that we have, which is a form to be used as a tool. Okay. And so the first thing, like, to answer your question, is that we agree that you will have some bias going on if you know everything, because it's happened, and you just confirmed that. There's cases of it, and you've confirmed it yourself. And so that this should start off as a skeletal analysis, hopefully in the blind as much as possible. That's not always possible. If you're recovering remains, like, you might see clothing and things like that, so it's not always possible. But certainly, as part of the working standard for like sex estimation, like, it should be as much about separating that skeletal analysis from context initially. Um, but as we move through this form, which starts out as skeletal sex estimation, in many forms, just but starting out that without any contextual information. This is kind of a collaborative idea, so that you should be collaborating with your, a medical legal team, coroners, MEs, archaeologists, um, and I don't think that you can unsee things that you've seen. You can just do the best you can, and so I think maybe you note, hey, I was there. You have, just like in cultural anthropology, you know your biases. That is a bias. You can't really undo those things, but you can say I was there. You could admit that this might be biasing, but you should still be, and that's why you should be as systematic as you can methodologically with the skeletal part of that, because that is the forensic anthropology part, and we want to keep that um, as separate as possible from the rest of it. Context should be there, which is the point of the form. That we should think about context. It's like a tool to work through. It's a thinking process. So you should not ignore context, and you should go about getting information about the context from various sources, including not just like law enforcement and medical legal, and archaeologists, but community members who have also knowledge that should be seen as the same level as knowledge as any other forensic scientist there, because they will a lot of times be teaching you a lot. But so yeah, I don't, Ashley, was there some other, did you have another component to answering that question?
No, that's basically the same way. And ideally, you'd have as many people as you could working on it. But if it has to, you work on the skeleton. For me, now, the way I do it, if you are limited in individuals, limited in the number of people you could work on, is you have the skeletal assessment, and then you start getting that contextual information and start going this back and forth to build that more fuller picture of who that individual was.
And I mean, I'm not an expert in like clothing. So if I have a historical skeleton and they have clothing, you know, I'm gonna, and sometimes it comes to you, sometimes it doesn't. Like
Yeah.
it depends on where, frankly, where you are in the country, the infrastructure like of forensics and archaeology, it really varies. Because I've gotten I got a gun once in a box of bones. So sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But like, so from one example from an historic archaeological site is that, we got some clothing like buttons and things. I know that there are people that specifically study buttons. I am not that person. I can say it's a button, and I'm going to ask somebody, and I'm going to put it over there and maybe email somebody. And then I'm going to do the thing that I know how to do. And you should be doing that as a forensic anthropologist. Like, you should not be uh, saying I'm an expert in this, or pretending in any way whatsoever that you know anything about clothing, because you don't. You know, as a person in the world, but that's it. And so that contextual information might be there when you don't want it at first, but you're not that expert, and you need to set it aside and then get those people that are, and then it's not always easy to do that either. And so a lot of things that some of the reasons behind some of this form was that were the basis of like cold cases. One of the best examples, which was now she was identified, was Julie Doe, Pamela Walton, by the DNA Doe Project. I can't remember if it was earlier. I think it was earlier this year. But Julie Doe is a very well-known case from Florida from the 80s, the late 80s.
Yeah.
And um, and I've used it like as an example for years before she was actually identified. I consult with the DNA Doe Project, and so it was a very long waiting. We knew she was identified. We had to wait quite a while until we could say that she was too. So, but it was years, it was many years. One of the longest, most complicated transgender female cases, which there aren't that many, but this is a great example of one that's really well known. And there was this, in this case, initially there was, when the body was discovered, there was clothing, there was like a skirt, long hair, nails, silicone breast implants, things like that, were associated. The forensic anthropologist was, I don't believe at a recovery, but was aware of these things. And so initially, when the report was written, it probably was a biasing factor. You don't know for sure. Nobody wrote that down, but it probably was. And they even suggested that this individual had given birth from parturition pits, which we do not use anymore for this purpose, but there was even that for this case. And so this case sat there and was relooked at in 2011. And the person that looked at it was like, oh, wait, I don't think that this is a female skeleton. I think that this is a male skeleton, and that these other things were biasing factors, and we shouldn't have considered them. And so this is when this case became more prominently known. And only again earlier this year, was this individual identified. They did do DNA, and so there was a karyotype, an XY karyotype, but also a very complicated story. This individual lived as a transgender female in Florida, and left, I think, Kentucky or Tennessee, one of those states, but they had a lot of family there. And it was a very complicated, I don't know, family tree for whatever reason. But this, if anybody looks it up, it's an interesting case to look at for transgender cases because of the artwork that was created, which is pretty terrible initially. Anybody can Google it. Julie Doe, you can Google Julie Doe and it'll come up. But the DNA Doe project redid the art when, after this 2011 analysis came out, to portray this as a human and not just like a man with a wig on, because that's essentially what it looked like as art. And so this is something that we're starting to do too. It's not just a reanalysis, but how can we put this into the public light where people have a different judgment of it, because we believe that, the public also has cognitive bias when they're looking at casework for those cases that they care about. We've seen this in numerous cases where people just have comments like, I can read Reddit about all these cases, and sometimes the comments are pretty terrible, or they're just like out of left field, and that can have to do with what we put out there, what the artist puts out there, or what a forensic anthropologist did or did not say. And so some of the practices for this co-stage form also have to do with, use of like more neutral terms than saying she or he and things like that, which might not be useful, because we know that uh, that of something like 35% of the, I'm trying to remember, 35% of the cases that were gender diverse cases through the human rights campaign were individuals that were dead named or misgendered. And so think about the fact that that's a high percentage of individuals then, that, if these were cold cases, that we're not looking beyond whatever sex they were listed on a database on. We're not looking beyond that because law enforcement isn't doing that. An anthropologist might think there's things beyond that and contextual things beyond that, but a police officer probably isn't. Now they're getting more training depending on where we are in the country. But there's some limitations, and I mean, I can talk about some of the issues of NamUs for like a while. I think we all probably could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've written about it several times. Like other people have written about some of the issues. Now, I'm not saying, like, in general, we need NamUs, okay? Like, let's not get rid of NamUs. We need NamUs. But anthropologists don't have as much input as we could on something like NamUs. We may or may not have any real input. We might just give our reports, to law enforcement, and the law enforcement may or may not use them to input information on NamUs, which is restricted on. First of all, it's not mandated, right? Like we all know that it's not a federal mandate that people use NamUs to list their unidentified or missing individuals. But it also is restricted for the section that talks about sex. And it's changed. We talk a little about that in this paper, how through time some of the terms and categories that might be listed have changed in NamUs for sex in particular. But that there's nothing like a pull down tab where you can say, this is the definition of the tab that I'm pulling down, and I want to use uncertain versus unknown versus what male and female. And I just said, I don't know. I don't have a great definition of these things. But yet, if those are the only categories and you have people that aren't thinking about the definitions, you're going to be quite limited. You're going to miss large proportions of groups of matching people that you could be looking for an unidentified person if you have those limitations. And so this form takes what we have in NamUs and says, so if this is what we have, the anthropologist has these answers with if the skeletal and the contextual information mesh with each other or don't mesh with each other, or you're missing data and cannot do sex estimation at all, what should we put into NamUs? And so we try to define that a bit better. And really like a large portion of this paper is kind of instructions on what we think based on the stakeholders of authors that we have, but also other individuals from the community, of what would work best for not excluding matches. Because once you start excluding matches, like once you're looking for just males and never females, that is 50-50 where we're really like in the system. That is, you're excluding 50% of what you're looking for. And almost nobody ever has the categories uncertain or other. Almost nobody ever uses them. An occasion in NamUs. And if they do, we don't know why. We don't know if it's because you're saying this person is intersex, or because you just have no idea, or you just didn't know the answer, or just put nothing. We don't know why. And so this form, we try to have at least the anthropologists initially walk through the process of why you're saying what you're saying and be as specific as possible. Hey, I can't determine sex because I'm missing all these parts of the skeleton. That should be written somewhere. It should be written really clearly somewhere, so that people can decide on going back and looking at cold case files again and what needs to be done. And it's not always written very clearly. Especially, it certainly isn't in NamUs, but even in an anthropological report, it might not be written. So it's kind of a process of like, let's go through and think about the what we're doing, how that can affect the case in the future. And eventually that gets down to gender and context, but it starts with skeletal sex estimation and how we got there as precisely as we can. Because even methods change, right? So I want to know what methods you used and why maybe you use those methods, because somebody can look at this case in the future and make better decisions about what they want to do with it if they know that. We don't all have access to, not, it would be great, but we don't have access to everybody's case files, and they might get lost. And so if we have like this as an appendix or something where this is more specific than the report that's written to law enforcement, which it probably will be, because they're not terribly specific. Some are super short. If you ever read an FBI one, it's super short. It leaves a lot of lackluster for the forensic anthropologist to be like, oh, that's all you put in a report? Yeah, because we're conforming it to the end product, the need, but not the long term of what a case could be. And so that's a problem with a case like Julie Doe, where you need to know long term. And this was one of the longest reports I ever read, was from Julie Doe, because it had a lot of, of the same type of law enforcement notes on it, but none of them were helpful for understanding what I would want to do in the future as an anthropologist. And this is, of course, if you use DNA or not use DNA. With skeletal analysis is still important, if anybody's wondering. And I do a lot of DNA, but it's still important to do. But yeah, so I wanted to bring up Julie Doe just because I was very excited. She was finally identified, along with a couple others, but people like the DNA Doe Project, if any students are interested. And we were talking about genealogy really quickly before we started here. And so forensic investigative genetic genealogy, FIG. I hope I got that one correct. For any of the students
That's the
interested.
big thing these days.
They change it all the time, but it's FIG. But so students can get involved in that too. I think NAMUS is starting to use FIG more regularly as well. So
Yeah.
No, I appreciate you saying that, because I think that's one of the things that I know for myself with report writing I struggle with a lot, because doing the job I do, there's obviously a lot of standardization that occurs and a lot of restrictions on how, like, analyses are presented, what analyses I can even do, like, are the methods in our standard operating procedures, can I even use the methods that maybe I want to, and those different types of things, because they all follow under certain accreditations that, while are really helpful for making sure that we're doing good science, can also sometimes be kind of limiting in some of that contextual information. And it's I know I often in peer reviews and other things, I tend to not write in my report because maybe, you know, that would make it too long or not conform to whatever. But in my notes, I tend to have a lot of detail of, like, and less so for sex assessment, because we don't tend to get
mm,
clothing or anything for our cases. Sometimes, but not always, and mostly not. Um, but just the fact that, like, I'm like, okay, well, I have a case that is military. Someone dug it up because they said it was this person and they just couldn't ID them in the 70s or whatever as that person. All of that information I know. And so, like, pretending I don't know that this is most likely a white man in his 20s is, to me, not transparent. And I think as anthropologists, that's one thing I try to that's one of those hills I'll always die on, of, like, maybe we can't control all of our biases. Maybe we can't mitigate and be objective to the extent that maybe some people want us to be, but we can at least be transparent about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we got to the conclusion that we're making, because otherwise people are left thinking that this is the only option, of, like, oh, well, you did this method, this has to be the answer, when that's not necessarily true. You're like, I did these methods and they gave me these results, but I used all of this other stuff to make my answer. And if you're not explicit and transparent about those things, then, maybe a future anthropologist will look at it and be like, oh, well, they had a score of 2 for a greater sciatic notch, so they're male and we're going to move forward, like,
yeah,
and that's not really how that works.
yeah.
So I
That's
just,
the best word, is the transparency. That's definitely the key here, is like try to be as transparent as you can as a human. However possible it is to do that as a human. If you have it written down, like somebody can look at it, and everybody is going to make mistakes, and that's just what we do. But if somebody can see that mistake in the future and that helps solve a case, and identify somebody, then good. I'm glad that you saw my mistake.
right, exactly. And I think that being not necessarily okay with being wrong, but being willing to say I can be wrong
Yeah, yeah,
is so important, because yeah, I would want someone to be like, "Hey, you messed up." And then for me to be like, "Oh, I did. Let me fix that problem." So one, this case can move forward, but also so that maybe I don't make that mistake moving forward,
yeah. And even what you're saying, um, where if you say like probable male or probable female and you write that in a report, you know, how is that seen? Is that they're just going to run with male and female? That's what they're going to run with. And that's not what we mean. And that is not what we mean at all. And so like in part of what we talk about for using this form is saying like, no, if you have if your stats come out and they say, and it's telling us probable, then you need to not say male or female. And you need to not put it in that category because that is, you're excluding matches.
Right.
And you can say why you're not putting it there, but that needs to be very clear. The language it should be put in as like unsure is what we suggest on NamUs, and why, and that's in the form, but unsure because you're not excluding one side, you know, the two halves that we have to look at in NamUs, by doing that. And so, and most people don't want to look at, they're not going to really look at the stats. Like they might ask us to say, what does that mean? But if you put probable male, they're putting male.
Right.
That's what's happening, and that's what's
We're
going into
trusting that we're
this.
doing the science and moving forward with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
But
the same thing with ancestry. Like it's the
yep.
same issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's why, even though like it's nice to have, it's
They
easier when
don't
you have a
stress the
standard
probable.
way. Hmm?
I said they don't stress the probable.
Yeah, yeah, which is the actually like that's the objective part of what we're trying to give it.
That's the important part, actually.
And but it just doesn't sound that way, and so it doesn't come off correctly. And we have a responsibility for them to understand, for people who are reading that to understand what that actually means.
Right.
Even if we have to put an extra line of what that means, then we have to do that because it's otherwise it's not being used, you know, in a way that it's intended, in the way that the stats are telling us. That's it's being interpreted incorrectly.
Right.
Yeah. And so this is kind of hopefully like a tool to work out some of those issues. We don't have necessarily like a you know, a paragraph of how to describe these things. But suggestions of if you're working with law enforcement and you have probable and you should suggest, well, what if we put unsure on NamUs and then describe why? That'll be more useful in the future. So we can do things like that as an anthropologist where, you know, you're able to suggest things. It depends, of course, on who you're working with and whether they think that's you know, they take you seriously or not. But you can try, and I think you have a responsibility to do that.
Right.
I actually, on my reports, when I go through everything, I'll always sort of interpret what each individual method is saying. And anytime it says probable or something like that, I italicize probable. So I'm stressing probable. I did want
Bold,
to ask.
italics, underline, bigger font.
Yeah,
What can we do, right?
this is the important part. I did want to ask, you know, when I give guest lectures and lectures to my classes on this topic, one of the things I bring up is if you look at the sort of the history almost of and it's all relatively recent history of the writings on you know, trans issues in forensic anthropology. You start right around 2019, 2018, 2019, and it's sort of methodology and identification, surgical modifications. I'm thinking very clearly Shaw and some of the others. And then it quickly jumps into why we need to do this, why we need to incorporate trans people into forensic anthropological research and knowledge and casework and just the gestalt of our field. And now we're starting to see with, say, Kosage and others that coming out. Where do you see, as we're wrapping up, where do you see the future of this topic being discussed? Particularly given how it's persona non grata in academia these days.
Yeah. Gosh, I and I think that's true for some of my co-authors. We're putting out the, hey, we should pay attention to this and think about this. But not so much like the methodology component that probably everybody wants. And but it also is attracting the interest of students. Um, and I think that that's been, and so education is probably one of the other biggest components here is educating people about the issue, the gap of knowledge in the forensic sciences and in forensic anthropology and the limits of our methods as well. And so I hope in the nearest future that that is part of the conversation in the classroom is to, because that is really where it has to start. Like our practicing forensic anthropologists are in the classroom right now, and so it needs to start with the thinking about this. Why should we think about this? And when we're talking about methods, it should not be biblical. It should not be the Bible of this is always correct. Like it should not be that. That is not a correct way of teaching for many reasons. That's just not how stats work, and that's not how diversity works. And so that should stop. Um, but to bring in diversity and that there's outliers in forensic anthropology are not outliers, or those are people that we are responsible for. And that needs to be said in the classroom. And this thought process, the reason why I think COSAGE is a good start here is because it is a tool to think through something. It reminds me of the bioarchaeology. In bioarchaeology, we have the index of care, where you're not giving an answer, but you're taking information from the environment, from culture, from any contextual information you can get, and putting it with the skeleton and trying to um, have a broader interpretation of things. And so it's like that. It's a think through process so that at least we can get our brain moving in a direction to include something broader than just look, that our responsibility is broader than just looking at you know, morphology of the pelvis and the skull. That it's beyond that. And as an anthropologist, like you didn't start anthropology to just look at morphology of the pelvis and the skull. You're doing forensic anthropology because you have another purpose in mind that's broader than that. And so you should try to remember that and apply it further. And you come from a biocultural field and it's beautiful and use it. It is significant.
I say, do you have any, I guess, like for the students that are listening to kind of like echo a little bit what you've just said, but like any advice for students who maybe want to get into this specific topic of work of pros, cons, places that, maybe a publication said you can't do this because of XYZ, or, like,
Mhm.
do you have any, I guess, just like advice in any direction for
Um,
students who want
For
to do this work?
certainly, like research wise, there is the queering bioanth like library resource that we created that's online through UNLV. And it's not just there for like, oh, there's research that's done on variation in sex and gender and all of anthropology and outside of it, but also for your own like personal edification as a human, that it might be interested in this for your own personal reasons, whatever they are. Then that you belong here doing this. And I've told many a student that's come up to me after like I gave a talk about Julie Doe and has like been ecstatic and also hugged me at the same time after this. My the biggest thing I say is that you have a question about it, like I can try to help you, point you in the right direction to the right people, but you belong here doing this, and this is important. And and not everybody is from the older school of thinking where that doesn't belong in the field. That's the fact that your brain's even thinking about this, like, I think is genius. Like, literally, I never thought about this when I was in college. It didn't come up into my, it's not come into my brain. And so when I have students bringing up, talking about uh, gender in forensic anthropology, I'm ecstatic that they are already abridging that biocultural need that it's just innate in anthropology. That's what we're doing in anthropology. Just continue that, contain it there. And there are people that want to do this and are doing this and will continue to do it um, through the ups and downs of any politics involved. Because it's needed more than ever. The stats of are there for why it's needed, and forensic anthropologists are not just there for like one major group of people. They're supposed to be there for everybody, and so not having this information is a detriment. And there's tons of research to be done. There's so much, but find that community. There are communities at every conference that will support you in research and personally. And it's changing, and it's depending on where you go, and there are people that can mentor you towards you know the positivity of this type of research. Just don't be afraid of it. It's there. It's a reality that it exists in other parts of anthropology. It's just newer. It's newer in forensics. And so that can always, being new is a little bit painful at first. You do have to defend yourself a little bit more, but we're trying to do that for you. So we're trying to put out those defenses to be more stable for the future research of it. And there are so many people that I can point students to who would love to work with them on this sort of topic.
No, I would definitely appreciate it because I know when I first started grad school, and so maybe this is, I don't know, advice slash we've all been through it situation for the students that are listening of like I went in and one of the topics that I was thinking about doing research was this, and I got nervous to a certain extent
Mm.
to be like, well, who am I to be talking about this as a cisgendered woman who at that point in her life had never been outside of Louisiana, and let's be real, we all know how Louisiana is. So I was just like, who am I supposed to be doing this research even though I have the questions? And I think the answer to that kind of is yes, because if you're interested in it and it comes from a empathetic, genuine place, not an otherizing place, I think it to like dive into it. I don't know. That's
This is
just
where being an anthropologist comes in too, because a cultural anthropologist has that problem every day for everything they do. And the answer is you bring in you bring in the stakeholders. The community has to be part of what you're doing. And they
yeah,
should always be part of what you're, and that's true in biological anthropology. Oh, like we know that very strongly now. Like in bioarchaeology, the community needs to be aware and part of decisions that are making. Same thing in forensic anthropology. The
right.
community that this impacts should be part of the decisions and the voice. Yeah.
Oh, that's blaspheme. That is blaspheme. I got into it, well, not got into it, but had a rather lively debate with an individual. I won't say who they were for just that very reason,
Mm-hmm.
because, well, we don't ask men, we don't ask women, we don't ask African Americans or anybody else when we do research on any of those topics. I just we
You see how
should.
well that went.
It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah, how well
just
did
because
that
you did in the
go?
past doesn't mean you shouldn't do now. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
We know better.
it was someone who's been in the field a long time. There again,
Mm-hmm.
you have that dividing line between been in the field a while and hasn't been in the field since, you know, archaic times.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't taught that in college. Nobody was telling me like you should involve the community. Nobody was doing that.
Nope. And when I started, that was the same way. As a matter of fact, it was no, you don't.
Yeah.
That would bias your research. That would bias what you're studying.
Or shut it
But we
down.
now know differently, or at least we
And I
argue differently.
Well, I think to a certain extent, and I this is one of my arguments for bias because that was my research, is bias isn't inherently negative. Like it
No.
just all biases is
Yes.
saying that it is affecting what you're doing. That could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing, but it's not. I think people assume automatically that you're like, oh, bias just means that you're a racist homophobe, and that's not what it means. Like you have
Yeah.
to look at the bigger picture of like, yes, everything's affecting everything else, and not all of that's bad. But
If you were a racist homophobe, you wouldn't be reflecting on it. So the bias is like it allows you to reflect.
facts.
Yeah. Yes. So, anyways, Sam, I want to thank you so much for joining us this lovely evening. It's been a
Thank you.
fascinating conversation, and I want to thank our audience for joining us. We're still working out who our next guest will be, but we will let you all know via the wonders of the evil that is social media. So,
And if you have any ideas, so like if you're
Mhm.
listening and you're like, I want to hear more about skeletal sex assessment, or I want to hear more about chromosomes, or I want to hear more about trauma, or like it doesn't necessarily have to be this topic in particular, but if you have a specific topic in mind that you want to hear about, or you have someone from the field that you're like, I have looked up to this person for so long and I want to hear their voice on a podcast just because I want to hear their voice, whatever. You can always let us know those types of things too.
email us at boneclubpodcast@gmail.com. We'll try to get a hold of everybody except for James Pekenis and Jane Beichtra. They scare me.
I'll email them. It's fine.
Well,
Yeah, it's okay. Well, we do thank you all for being here, and until next time, thanks for having us on the Bone Club.
Thank you
and
guys.
have a wonderful Canadian Thanksgiving to our
Yeah.
Canadian friends.
Yes.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Hello, friends. We here at the Bone Club understand how difficult it is for students to break into the field of forensic anthropology. To help with that cause, we have decided to monetize in a way by setting up an account with Patreon. All proceeds will be donated to the anthropology section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences to help alleviate the cost of attending an annual scientific conference for students. If you can, we have set up 4 membership tiers with patreon.com/theboneclub that range from $3 a month to our patrons of the bones at $15 a month. We hope some of you can join us in this worthy endeavor of breaking down the barrier of cost that keeps many students away from these important conferences. So if you can, please join us at patreon.com/theboneclub. Thank you, and may your skeletons always be complete.